بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلوات والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. I believe does this work at all here? Is Hakam still here somewhere? Went to the computer room, alright. Let me see what I can do here. Yeah, let's see if you can, just so it's easier for everybody to. Alright, I believe we finished last time. So we'll be doing a continuation of our tafsir of Surah Al-Hujurat, for those of you that were. Hey, Assalamu alaikum. You said slides are a problem, right? Can I display something though? Anything? I can't display anything. Okay, khalas, no worries then. So we'll be doing a continuation of the tafsir of Surah Al-Hujurat. I believe we got through verse number 1 last time. Do you remember what we went through? We didn't start it at all. We did the introduction, but did we start it at all? We didn't. Last time we did it was February, because March was the retreat. Yeah, chapter 49. We said that we were going to go through the chapter, but I just want to know how much we went through. Oh, the reasons for revelation. Okay, Grace. Okay, perfect. All right, Bismillah. So, this particular chapter of the Quran, chapter 87, for those of you that don't remember, chapter 49. Chapter 49 of the Quran is entitled the chapter called Hujurat. And Hujurat is the plural of the word hujra. And a hujra is a small room. Okay? And the title of the chapter is called The Small Rooms. And the reason that it's called that is because the first couple of verses of this chapter took place around the small rooms, the houses of the Prophet ﷺ. Who remembers why certain chapters are given certain names? Does anybody remember? We said that certain chapters are given certain names for specific reasons. Does anybody remember? Okay, so it might have to do with the occasion why the chapter was revealed. Okay, what else? Okay, perhaps the reason why it was revealed. What else? Like, why our chapters have the names that they have? Okay, that might have to do with the content, but not necessarily why they're named the way that they're named. Okay, particular events. So, so remember we said that the main reason is because chapters of the Quran were never given an official name. Okay? Some of them are named by the Prophet ﷺ, like Al-Fatiha. Okay, so Al-Fatiha was given a name by the Prophet ﷺ himself. But the vast majority of chapters were not given a name by the Prophet ﷺ. And they were actually named by the companions themselves as a way of referencing them. So what did they base the names of these chapters on? Well, they based them primarily on maybe a word that occurs in this chapter in the Quran that does not occur anywhere else in the Quran. For example, this chapter, the chapter of Hujurat. The word Hujurat does not appear anywhere else in the Quran. And as a result, this chapter was called Hujurat. Now, what is the reason behind why the first set of verses were revealed? A clan from Banu Tamim, the name of the clan was Banu Tamim. During the 9th year of the Hijrah, now just to contextualize, the entire lifespan of the Prophet ﷺ is divided into 3 categories. Okay? The first category is pre-prophethood. Okay, so from the time he was born until he was 40 years old, this time period is referred to as pre-prophethood time period of the Prophet ﷺ's life. Okay? This time period we don't have a lot of information about, apart from what the Prophet himself told us, or what maybe some of the older companions told us about the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's one time period. The second category is from the initiation of prophethood at the age of 40 until he migrated to Medina at the age of 53. So those first 13 years of prophethood are given their own title, which is pre-migration or post-prophethood. Either way works. Okay? They're referred to as both. Okay? So from the first revelation until migration is 13 years, and it's referred to as either pre-migration or post-prophethood. And then migration itself, right, serves as the basis of our calendar that we have now. Okay, so you always see the Islamic calendar being 1440 is what we're at now. And you always see AH, right, after Hijrah, after migration. Okay, so 1440 years ago was when the Prophet made that migration from Mecca to Medina. That migration now serves as our third point or reference or time period in the Prophet ﷺ's life, which is post-migration. And post-migration is only 10 years. Okay? So the entire life of the Prophet ﷺ is divided into 3 categories: pre-prophethood, and then 13 years of post-prophethood, pre-migration, known as the Meccan period also. Okay? And then you have post-migration to his death, which is known as after Hijrah, or the Medina time period. Okay? So all the references of the seerah, okay, the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, will fit into one of these 3 categories. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So the revelation of the Quran began, obviously, not in the pre-prophethood era. It began in the Meccan period, right? And then it ended in the Medina period. Okay? This particular chapter, where does it fall in the chronology in terms of revelation? Was it in the Meccan period or was it in the Medina period? Does anybody remember? Falls in the Medina period. Okay? Falls in the Medina period. And where, more or less, in the Medina period? The beginning, the middle, the end? Does anybody remember? So the first class or 2 we had were 2 months ago, 3 months ago. So no surprise that people don't remember. So that's fine. We'll recap everything. This particular chapter, okay, was revealed in the 9th year after the Hijrah. How many years did we say the post-migration period was? 10 years. So this was 9. Okay, so 1 year before his death. Okay, so it was one of the last chapters to be revealed. Okay? There are how many chapters in the Quran? 114. It is said that this was probably 109 or 110 in terms of chronology. Remember that the Quran is not organized according to chronology. Okay? The Quran itself is not organized in chronology. In chronological order, how did we say that the Quran was organized? Does anybody remember? Okay, very good. So there's actually difference of opinion in terms of how the Quran is organized. Yes, the verses are organized by Jibreel alayhi salam. Remember we said that Jibreel would come in the month of Ramadan and he would sit with the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and he would organize, put this verse in this place and this verse in this place. Okay, so the order of the verses in each chapter is divinely protected. The question is, what about the order of the chapters themselves? What do you notice about the Quran in terms of the organization of the chapters? Visually, yeah. Exactly. From largest to smallest, right? So that's something that the companions themselves did, and we talked about that earlier in more detail. Um, I'm debating now whether I should go back. Should I just go back from the beginning and assume that nobody knows anything? Okay, let me go back all the way from the beginning. All right. Bismillah. The Quran was first revealed in the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, in the month of Ramadan, okay, on what is known as Laylatul Qadr. Okay. Now, we see in the Quran that Allah says, "Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr." Indeed, we have revealed it on the night of Qadr. We can talk about what that word means later. But we also know that the Quran was revealed over 23 years. So how do we reconcile between the Quran saying we revealed it on the night of Qadr and we revealed it over 23 years from what we actually know? Does anybody remember? I'll assume nobody knows anything. Okay. So the way that we reconcile this is the Quran was revealed from the highest heaven to the lowest heaven in one shot. Okay? And Allah did not reveal the verses of this Quran all at once to the Prophet. He gave the Prophet verses over time, over those 23 years. Okay? All of the previous books that we believe in, the Torah, the Gospel, all of these different books, according to our tradition, these books, even the tablets of Moses and all that, they were all revealed in one shot. Everything at once to the Prophet, okay? Or whichever Prophet it was. Our Quran is unique in the sense that it was not revealed all at once. It was revealed piecemeal over the span of 23 years. Okay? Now, the Quran, the way that you have it structured now, okay, is broken up into 114 different chapters. Okay? Each chapter has a set of verses that are organized 1 to 10, 1 to 100, 1 to 200, and whatever. Okay? The order of the verses, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, the order of the verses is divinely protected and inspired. Okay? Every month of Ramadan, Jibreel would come to the Prophet and he would say, put this verse in this place and this verse in this place. Okay, so every month, every year, he would come in the month of Ramadan and he would organize the verses of the chapter with the Prophet ﷺ himself. So when we recite Fatiha or when we recite any chapter of the Quran, we know that the order of the verses that we're going in is divinely inspired and divinely protected. Now, the Quran, the word Quran itself, means something that is recited. Okay? So, do you recite something by reading it, or do you recite something from, essentially, recitation implies vocalization. It does not imply reading. Okay? So the Quran initially was not necessarily intended, but the concept of the Quran being a book was not something that was known to the Prophet ﷺ himself. So when we talk about Quran, Quran is meant to be something that is recited and memorized from memory, not something that is to be read. So that's why what happened was immediately after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, his companion Abu Bakr assumed the position of leadership. And during his time, there were a lot of people that had completed the memorization of the Quran. However, during a particular battle, over 70 of these companions who had committed the entire Quran to memory were killed. And all of a sudden, you had a scarcity in the number of people that had memorized the Quran entirely. So now Abu Bakr thought, if people who memorize the Quran are passing away, we need to figure out another way to preserve the Quran. So what Abu Bakr decided to do was that they were going to document the Quran in written form. Okay? When the Prophet ﷺ would receive revelation, he received revelation bit by bit. Verse here, verse there, chapter here, chapter there. It was never the entire Quran at once. So when he would receive revelation, he would tell, okay, this companion, write down these verses. This companion, write down these verses. And these verses were scattered amongst all of the companions. So what Abu Bakr decided to do was he said, okay, we're going to gather all of these different, parchments and all of that where the verses are written, and we're going to collect them in one book. Okay, so the idea of collecting the Quran in one book was actually initiated through the companion Abu Bakr. And it was not something that the Prophet ﷺ, they didn't have a need for it, and thus they never did it. But now Abu Bakr noticed that there was a need for it, and so he did it. So when it came time now, after Abu Bakr passed away, and after his successor Umar passed away, the third successor, by the name of Uthman, decided that we need to now make several copies of this Quran, and we need to send it to all of the different provinces in the Muslim world so that they can learn the Quran. Does that make sense? So what he did is he needed to compile the Quran in a universal format that would not change. Meaning that if I'm going to share this Quran, it needs to be standardized. Okay? So what he did was he started with the chapter of Al-Fatiha. Al-Fatiha means the opening. So it makes sense that Fatiha will be the first chapter. After that, however, there was no particular commandment from the Prophet to say you need to structure it in a certain way. So what Uthman did was he structured the Quran by and large from the largest chapter to the smallest chapter. And that's why you see the Quran organized in that way. Okay? So what is sacred about the Quran is not necessarily the order of the chapters, but the verses within the chapter. Okay? So that's very important to understand. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. After that, the Quran, we said, was divided into 114 chapters. The Quran is also divided according to the time period of revelation. Okay, so apart from the names of chapters, apart from the order of the Quran is also divided into time period in terms of when the chapters were revealed. And remember how I said that the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ is divided into three categories, right? Pre-prophethood, Meccan period, and Medina period. Okay? Chapters of the Quran are also divided in this way. Chapters of the Quran are divided into if they were revealed prior to the migration, the Meccan period, or if they were revealed post-migration in the Medina period. Okay? So depending on the chapter, right? So, for example, Surah Al-Fatiha would be a Meccan chapter because it was revealed prior to the migration. The particular surah that we were going to start covering today, Surah Al-Hujurat, was revealed after the migration. So it's referred to as a Madani or Medina chapter of the Quran. Okay? The chapter that we want to be covering, or I hope to cover inshallah, is the 49th chapter of the Quran. Okay? The number 49, as you now know, does not necessarily imply that it was the 49th chapter to be revealed. Because remember, we said that the order has nothing to do with when it was revealed. Okay? So this particular chapter, the 49th chapter, Surah Al-Hujurat, was revealed towards the end of the Medina period, only a year before the Prophet ﷺ passed away. So it might be the 49th chapter in order, but in terms of chronologically speaking, when it was revealed, it was towards the very end. Okay? And it was believed to be perhaps the third or fourth to last chapter of the Quran to be revealed. Okay? So there are a lot of themes in this particular chapter that are very different from the chapters that came early on. The chapters that are pre-migration have certain themes, certain characteristics. Chapters that are post-migration also have certain themes and certain characteristics. For example, chapters that were revealed pre-migration the verses tend to be shorter. Okay? The verses tend to be more rhyming and poetic. The verses tend to talk more about paradise and hellfire. They tend to talk about the belief system more. Chapters that were revealed post-migration, the rhyming pattern is lost. The verses tend to be much longer than they were compared to the Meccan chapters. And the verses tend to talk about laws and regulations, and not so much about paradise and hellfire, not so much about the belief system. These verses also tend to talk more about the people of the book. They tend to talk more about hypocrisy, because those were things that were relevant to Medina, that weren't relevant in Mecca. Because remember, in Mecca, was there any necessarily benefit to being a Muslim in Mecca? No, because people were being persecuted. People were being tortured. People were being cast out of the city. So anybody who was Muslim during the Meccan period, by pretty much we can assume safely that they were genuinely Muslim. Okay? So hypocrisy is not talked about in the Meccan chapters. But in the Medina chapters, in Medina specifically, now there was a benefit to be Muslim. The Muslims were in charge. The Muslims were in power. The Muslims had numbers. So why wouldn't somebody want to claim to be Muslim, reap the benefits, but at the same time have nothing to do with the belief system? So issues pertaining to hypocrisy are more relevant in the verses in Medina. Yes? Even I couldn't tell you.
How would you identify which one it is just after reading it? Then you can say, well, that's probably that's
Great question. So,
because of the criteria you're saying.
the longest chapter in the Quran, chapter number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, and many chapters like it, are a combination of Mecca and Medina. So you don't base it off of, and some chapters were entirely revealed in one period, like Fatiha, all in Mecca, Hujurat, all in Medina. And some chapters, like Surah Al-Baqarah and others, are a combination of Mecca and Medina. So, me personally, I couldn't tell you, especially for the longer chapters, which one it is, because you'll have a combination of the two, right? So for shorter chapters, you can tell, because either the verses are shorter or the verses are longer. But for ones that are combined, you would, even myself, we would have to go back to the books of tafsir, of Quranic explanation, to figure out which one it is. But the classification isn't necessarily of great importance. Yeah, it's not necessarily of. This is just the scholars really love to categorize and classify things, but in terms of importance, it's not all that important. Okay. Yeah. Hmm. Sure. So the question is about the different uh, versions or copies of the Quran that existed. The Quran was revealed in what we would call 7 different styles. What do I mean by that? One, I'm sorry? No, no, no. So it was a rhetorical question. The Quran was revealed in 7 different styles. Okay, what does that mean? What it means is that the Arabs of this time period spoke in different dialects. They spoke in different ways, and similar to today, we're all Americans, but the Bostonians speak differently than the Jersey, than the Florida, than the Georgia, than the Tennessee, than the Chicago, than the California, right? Everybody has an accent, okay? Let alone Australia and Britain and New Zealand and all of these different places, right? So the Arabs amongst themselves spoke in these different dialects. Some words were used over others. So when Jibreel came with that initial revelation, the Prophet ﷺ asked him, hey, not all the Arabs are going to be able to understand or access the Quran as easily if we don't give them other options, meaning different styles, different, I don't want to cut a language, but just different vernacular that could potentially reach them better. So Jibreel eventually came down with 7 different styles, okay? 7 different manners in which the Quran might be recited. All of them with the same message and the same meaning, right? But just different ways of perhaps phrasing the message so that the other Arabs from different areas would be able to understand it. What ended up happening was that when Islam spread into Persia, into Europe, into Northern Africa, these different styles started to spread also. And in one particular area, they had one style, and another particular area, they had another style. And what ended up happening was when the Muslims from these different areas would come together and they would pray behind one another, they would accuse the other of, hey, that's not the Quran that I know. Your Quran sounds different. You're inventing the Quran. So all of these different accusations started to spread. So what Uthman did is he said, you know what? We're going to consolidate all of these different styles, and we're going to pick the style upon the people of the Prophet ﷺ, the people of Quraysh, the language of Quraysh, and we're going to disregard the other 6. The other 6 are valid, they're important also. But Uthman decided that the language and the tribe and the custom of the Prophet himself is going to take precedent over all of the other different styles because the other ones are causing confusion. So he got rid of the other 6 and he kept the one that was upon the language, we'll say, of the Prophet ﷺ. And that copy is what he made copies of, and that's what he distributed to the lands after that. Okay? So everything that we have today is based off of that initial copy that Uthman standardized, essentially. So to answer your question, some of the companions would be taught the Quran privately from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there may be variations from what Uthman wanted to standardize. So Uthman, because he wanted to standardize the Quran out of for the sake of not being problems down the road, he asked all of the other companions, if you have anything that differs from what I have, you need to get rid of it for the sake of standardization. Does that make sense? So some of the companions were obviously very upset because they said, hey, I learned this from the Prophet himself. I know that it's correct. You can't tell me that it's wrong. But Uthman was looking at the bigger picture. And he said, you and I can understand that it's correct. But a generation from now, people are going to fight about it. So we need to just make one standard copy and go from there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other questions before I move on? So there are actually different words also entirely. And there's a story of Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman who came back to Uthman, and he initially told him of what was going on. And he said that there was an occasion where someone was reciting the verse وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ, which is what we have in the Quran now, and complete the Hajj and Umrah for the sake of Allah. And another person was reciting it وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ إِلَى الْبَيْتِ, to the house instead of to Allah. So the words are completely different. Is the message the same? Message isn't the same? But is the message, the overall message is the same? Okay? So even though the words might be different. So the case in point, the words were completely different, right? So in that particular regard, yes, the words may have been different, and that's why Uthman wanted to standardize it. Yeah. And again, same thing with, and this happened in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ when a companion was reciting a particular chapter of the Quran. And then Umar radiallahu anhu came up to him afterwards and he said, he was very angry with him. He said, you're inventing the Quran because I learned this chapter from the Prophet and he didn't teach it to me this way. So the both of them went to the Prophet ﷺ, and Umar recited and the other companion recited, and the Prophet ﷺ said it was revealed in both of these styles. And the words were, and Umar himself didn't recognize the other recitation. And he was Umar, right? So this is the story of the compilation of the Quran there's a lot of history, a lot of detail, and for the sake of brevity, I don't want to go into all the details, which I already went beyond. Yes? Mm-hmm. What you produce in terms of noise, right, in vocalization, yes, it does count as Quran. But would you get the same reward as someone who is holding the Quran and reciting the Arabic? That might be a different story. I don't want to discourage you from reading the transliteration necessarily, but what I also want to emphasize is that we cannot rely on transliteration forever, right? Then if that were the case, then what's the benefit of learning Arabic, right? So use the transliteration, right? But don't make that the ends, right? We should encourage ourselves to learn the Arabic language, and if that takes you a year or two, then that's fine. Learning how to read the Quran, I've taught that class in 6 weeks. So you can learn how to read the Quran very, very quickly. Knowing Arabic is a totally different issue. I'm not talking about learning Arabic. I'm talking about learning how to read the Quran. You can do that in 6 weeks because I've taught that class in 6 weeks. So we have a saying in Arabic, man jadda wajad. Whoever puts in an effort will find what they're looking for. So it's just about how badly do you want it? Not you, but how badly does somebody want it? And yes, I taught it here several years ago. I haven't taught it in a while, actually. They teach the class here every Sunday. They have Quran Institute here, or Institute of whatever it's called, IQ or QI. Um, they every Sunday they have a class. Now, depending on who your teacher is, you might not make it in 6 weeks. It might take you a little bit longer. But that class is offered here every Sunday. So I wouldn't, it's you don't have to go very far. You can come here for the morning class, Arabic, and then stay afterwards for the class after Dhuhr. So, okay. All right. Now, any other questions related to the Quran? Nothing? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uthman. Yeah. 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 So remember, in Arabia there were different tribes in different areas, and the predominant tribe in Mecca, where the Prophet is from, is the tribe of Quraysh. Okay? And Quraysh had their own dialect and nuance, right? You go 100 miles in another direction, another tribe, another nuanced language, right? So when Uthman was looking at all of these different dialects, he said, okay, what was the basic? What is the default? What if we're going to choose one, which one are we going to choose? He said, I'm going to choose the language and the dialect of the Prophet, right? And I'm going to essentially uh, standardize the Quran upon this particular one because it was the one that came to the people of the Prophet. Does that make sense? So that's what he chose to use as the standard. Yeah. Yes? You, go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Very good. So the Quran as a whole, Allah says about the Quran that it is huda, a guidance, it is shifa, it is a cure, it is a rahmah, it is a mercy. This is referring to the Quran as a whole. Then within the Quran you have certain verses and even certain chapters that have special qualities more so than others. Okay? For example, Ayatul Kursi, right? The verse of the throne in the second chapter. It is recommended to recite this particular verse after every prayer. It's recommended to recite this verse before one goes to sleep. Okay? So there's different times for it. There's virtues for the person who memorizes chapters 2 and 3. So chapter Baqarah and the family of Imran. There's virtues for that. Before going to sleep, reciting the last 2 chapters of the Quran. So there's different particular things. So in terms of the authenticity of certain things, because that's really the issue that we want to get to. unfortunately, a lot of people in their enthusiasm and their love for certain chapters or certain verses will tell people, hey, if you read this 10 times and this 7 times and this, such you'll get such and such. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff needs to be really vetted. So I would suggest that before you forward any type of message, or before anybody forwards any type of message, to ask a person of knowledge to authenticate the veracity of the claim that's in that particular message. Surah Al-Mulk, for example, is considered to be one of the surahs that we should read before we go to bed also. Surah Yasin after Fajr, I personally have not come across anything that suggests that we should do that. So, not to say that it doesn't exist, but I just haven't come across it. So, before we undertake any type of regular practice, we should authenticate what the source is. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. I know we've kind of been all over the place today, unfortunately, so I'm going to continue being all over the place. I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions that you might want. I don't know how many convert imams you guys get here to come and teach the class, so I figured that because you have one in front of you today, you might feel more comfortable asking more convert-related questions than at any other time. So, anybody consider this a mini coffee with the Shaykh that you usually do on Fridays. Yes. Oh, mashallah, great. Congratulations. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The transition, yeah. Mm-hmm. So how to make the transition easier? Is that the question, or? Yeah. I think number one, exposure and knowledge are going to help a lot in this regard. Um, One very interesting way that a evangelical, because I did a interfaith thing with a minister once, and he said um, the difference between Christians and perhaps other faiths is that Christians, in his idea, Christians work from salvation, and I guess everybody else works towards salvation. What does that mean for those of you that don't understand? So, Christian theology assumes that you're already saved. If you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you're already saved. So all of the actions that you do are a way of, I guess, thanking or appreciating that salvation because you're already saved. Whereas with Muslims, the reason we do good deeds is to attain that salvation because it's not guaranteed or promised to us, right? So I think that learning a lot of the fundamentals in terms of the theological aspect of it is very, very important. I would just give it time, and I would find one person that is a person of knowledge, that a person that you trust, um, and use them as your main back and forth. Because a lot of times when a convert comes into the community, you know, because the convert is usually starting from nothing, everybody in the community suddenly appears to be knowledgeable and know what they're talking. Oh, I've been Muslim my whole life, so I can speak about Islam. Oh, really? I've been mixing Kool-Aid my whole life. That doesn't mean that I'm qualified to talk about chemistry, right? So it's very important uh, for the convert to find someone in the community that is a person of knowledge, a person that they trust, to whenever they hear some new information, that they can go and fact check it with someone else. Because as well intended as people can be, sometimes they don't know what the hell they're talking about. So it's very important to find that person and build a relationship with that person. So that would be my advice to you. Yeah. Mhm. Jazakallah khair. Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mhm. 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 Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so the question was about the concept of having a sacrifice, um, and what is kind of our, not necessarily position, but what is our alternative, I guess. Um, First of all, is that you'll never be able to convince someone that doesn't want to be convinced or be open-minded or up to discussion, right? So usually when I speak to people, you can tell within the first couple minutes if they're genuinely asking to understand or if they're asking to argue, right? And if people are asking to argue, I usually just smile and nod my head. Yeah, you're right. I never thought of that, and then just kind of ignore them. Um, huh? Yeah, I'm not into that. That's not me. Some people are into that. I'm not into that. I have better things to do. So yes, yes, okay, and then that's it. In terms of how do we understand that, um, they believe in a sacrifice because they also believe in original sin, right? The concept that sin is inherited, right? That you're born already sinful, right? Whereas with us, we don't have that concept, right? Um, you لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. We don't inherit sin. Every person, every individual person only bears what they have reaped with their own hands, right? So if that's the case, then there's really no need for a sacrifice, right? Because what I have earned, I can also ask for forgiveness for, right? Whereas with if I'm already burdened with something that I didn't do, right, then someone else needs to come and remove that burden from me, which we don't believe in that concept anyways. So, trying to put a square in a round hole, it's never going to fit. So clearly she's never going to understand that because we're coming from two completely different directions, right? So, understanding, having a working understanding of Christian theology is important, right? Because we live in a Christian country, number one. We are surrounded by Christians all the time, Christians, Catholics, all the other denominations. So having a basic understanding of the people around us is very, very important. So for those of you that aren't too familiar with Catholicism or with Christianity, I would really recommend that you do a little bit of basic reading. One book that I do highly recommend for Judaism in particular, there's a book called An Introduction to Judaism for Muslims. The author is Reuven Firestone. Amazing, amazing book. He he explains Judaism through the lens of Islam. So he says, how in Islam you have this and this and this? I'm like, yeah. He said, okay, well in Judaism, this is what we have, which is similar. So it's a very nice comparison between the two, and it explains Judaism for a Muslim in Muslim terms. An Introduction to Judaism for Muslims. The author is Reuven Firestone. You can look it up on Amazon. Just type in Firestone, An Introduction to Judaism, and then it should pop up. And then there's a sister book, which is An Introduction to Islam for Jews. So it's the other way. I'm still looking for the Muslim one. I haven't found it yet, but I would recommend it. For Judaism, that's an excellent book. Yeah. Yes? Okay. Yeah. The bare minimum is one. Okay. As long as you do it once correctly and water reaches all aspects of the arm in one shot, that's sufficient. The sunnah, what is preferred, is to do it 3 times. Okay? But if you do it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times on accident, that's sufficient. But intentionally going above 3 would be frowned upon because that's not what the Prophet himself did, right? So I would say, if you're not sure that I do it 3 or did I do it 4, add another one. That's not a problem. But intentionally going above 3 is problematic. Yeah. But the validity of the wudu is still there. The wudu is still valid. Yeah. Anything else? It's open. Yeah. Anybody? Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Good. So, how does a person come to Islam or start practicing more when they have other things on their plate? Um, my teacher in Medina, he used to live here in America. He was born and raised in America and moved to Medina. Um, he, was giving dawah in all different shapes and sizes for like close to 40 years. So, one of the valuable lessons that he learned himself and then shared with us um, was that you have to address a person's physical and mental needs before you address the spiritual needs, right? So if a person comes and they're addicted to drugs, or they're homeless, or they're upside down financially and this and that, um, nobody wants to spend time focusing on spiritual issues when they're struggling to put food on the table, right? Doesn't make sense. Um, and that's I think what is it? Haslow was the name, the hierarchy of needs. I forgot. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So the first one is the physical, right? You have to address the hunger, the shelter, all of these different things before you can start to build yourself up. Um, so same thing in Islam, right? So we need to make sure that the person has a good job, they have a place to live, they have food on the table, that they're not dealing with any type of mental illnesses, that they have gotten therapy for all of the problems that they went through early on in life, et cetera, et cetera. And then when a person is, okay, now I can actually focus on the spiritual aspect, that's when, we should start focusing on that with them. But um, to expect a person to empty their cup of everything that's going on in their life and just give it to you empty to fill with Islam, I think is a little bit unrealistic. So focusing on the physical and the mental before you focus on the spiritual, I think, in my opinion, is the way it should be. I mean, I would have to know more what type of resentment and all that. So again, grudges to who? Like, there's a whole life history that we would need to get into, which is not the time and place right now. Yes, the quick version. We actually did a program here a couple weeks ago about that. Quick version is I had a friend that I met up with after high school, and essentially through one night's conversation with him, um, kind of dispelled any of the negative preconceptions that I had about Islam, and that was it. That was it. Yep, pretty straightforward. Yeah, I didn't have any, unicorns or anything in my dreams that came and spoke to me or anything like that. Yeah, yeah. My story is very boring. Uh, yeah. Anybody else? Nobody has family issues or other convert issues that they wanna. Yes. Hmm. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. So the question was, you start off hot and then you get cold, and then what can you do about it? Um, and I experienced the same thing. I would say the first 2.5 years that I was Muslim, I tried to attend and do everything physically possible. And then about 3 years in, I realized that I was building this beautiful house of actions, right? But it didn't have any type of foundation to it, right? And it was essentially a house of cards, right? And you move the table a little bit, and then what happens? The whole thing comes down. So I really had to kind of reassess my strategy here. Um, so I think it's very important, and then it's a whole problem with the convert process. The convert process is a lot of it, we come in with the understanding that I'm going to do all of these external actions, and then somehow they're going to feed my faith on the inside. But it doesn't work like that, right? The actions should be a manifestation of the faith within, right? Not the actions somehow through osmosis we're going to learn faith, right? So the perspective is very important. So what I would suggest to all of the old and new converts is that we really focus on the foundational spiritual aspects, right? Building that connection with Allah, building that connection with the Prophet ﷺ. And then once we have, that faith, the actions come naturally, right? You don't really have to force them, right? So that's so. How do you kind of get back on track? I would say pick one thing and be consistent in it. The Prophet ﷺ said, doing a small action consistently is more beloved to Allah than doing a lot of things all at once. So maybe it's time to come back on Sundays and start learning Arabic. Maybe it's time to do something else. But, doing something small, like I always use this example. How do you eat grapes? One at a time. Do you ever see anybody put the whole bunch in their mouth? Only maybe your kids. But generally speaking, how do you eat grapes? You pick one and you eat it, right? So knowledge is the same way, right? You have to take the grapes one by one, and eventually you'll get through the whole bunch, right? But you have to do it one by one. So pick one thing that you really enjoy and have a passion for, and then build off of that. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Or what exactly? Um, I don't recall. Again, I don't want to say unequivocally that there's not. Um, from what I can recall off of the top of my head, um, there isn't a particular time where good or bad. So again, I'm going to talk about time and I'm going to talk about places. Okay. Um, in terms of time, I don't recall any particular time of the year where good deeds are multiplied or bad deeds are multiplied, only with the exception of perhaps Laylatul Qadr, where if we catch the night, it's like 83 and a half years or whatever worth of worship. In terms of places, yes, for sure, because in Mecca and Medina, which are considered haram, sacred areas, if you sin in these areas or if you do good deeds in these areas, they do multiply. Um, but in terms of specific times of the year, Allahu alam. Not saying it doesn't exist. Maybe I just forgot or haven't heard of it, but I don't. I would need more information now. So the the story goes, and I'm only answering this because Ramadan is right around the corner. Uh, the Prophet ﷺ was told about a man from previous generations that for 83 years he would fight in the sake of Allah all day, and at night he would pray all night. That's all he would do for 83 years. So the Prophet ﷺ said, well, my nation is never going to be able to achieve anything like that because our lifespans just aren't that long to be able to do that. So essentially, what Allah told him was that what I'm going to do for your nation in particular is that if they stand in prayer or do good deeds on the night of whatever the one of the last odd 10 nights of Ramadan is, if they pray or whatever during that time, I will count it for them the value of 1,000 months. So, but we don't know. We can say it's in the last 10 nights and on the odd nights, but we don't know which night it is exactly. And I actually think that's a mercy on the part of Allah, because if you think about it, if we knew exactly what night it was, if you knew you would target it, but what happens to the person who misses it? Could you imagine the amount of sin, what a transgression against Allah that would be for a person who knew when it was and still missed it? Right? So Allah in His mercy says, if you catch it, you get the reward. And if you miss it, there's no sin upon you. Right? So just on lookout on the last 10 nights and to be, committed on those nights. Okay? Anything else Ramadan related, since Ramadan is right around the corner? Yes. Um, I wouldn't have given you that advice. Um, I wouldn't. No, I would not. Yes. Yes. Yeah, you, Sister Smith, yeah. Salam. Okay. Wait, we have 5 minutes, so yes, go ahead. So, sunrise is the end of the Fajr time. So, um, the mosque will, I'm sure, produce a paper prayer schedule for you to follow. Um, the time that Fajr enters should, but slightly before that, should be the beginning of the fast. Okay, so let's say Fajr comes in at 5 a.m. Okay, so to be on the safe side, I'll stop eating, 4:55, 4:56, whatever, because in order to make sure that you've completed the full time of fasting, you're going to have to fast a little before the time comes in and a little after the time goes out. right? Just to make sure that you caught the whole thing. Does that make sense? So whatever the time is, I would just stop eating, minute or two or three before that, and then begin the fast. But it's not sunrise; it's before that sunrise, whenever that fajr time is. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Usually that's the case. Yeah. Um, Unfortunately, what a lot of people do is the adhan, the call to prayer for fajr will be going off, and people are still eating and drinking. Okay, and they said, no, as long as I finish before the adhan, it's fine. No, that's absolutely incorrect. So don't get that misinformation. You need to stop before the time enters. The adhan has nothing to do. Because what if someone calls the adhan 10 minutes later? All right, so the adhan is nothing to do with it. Make sure that you stop eating before the time. Okay. Anything else? Ramadan really? Yes. Yes, yeah. So essentially, that the hadith said that he would go to sleep and he wouldn't hold any type of hatred towards his Muslim brothers or sisters before he went to sleep. Yeah. So essentially, forgiving them for anything that they may have done. All right. One last question. Anybody before we wrap up? One last advice. Take it slow. Um, we want to jump in the ocean before we even learn how to swim. So my advice is just take it slow. If somebody says you should be doing this and you should be doing that and this and that, and well, you should be minding your own business. And so my journey is my journey, and yes, there are certain fundamental things that you need to do right away: purification and prayer. Everything else after that needs to be done at a time when it's right for you. And that doesn't mean that I never get around to it. I'm not saying that. But we need to, be making milestones. We always need to be improving. Okay? So look at yourself a year ago and ask, okay, what was I doing a year ago and have I improved from last year? And if you have, then great, continue to make strides. But if you're the same, then you haven't made any improvements. Actually, it's not the same, it's down. Right? Because that's a year of your life that you've spent without any improvement whatsoever. Right? So make sure that even if, like I said, it's a bunch of grapes, one at a time. So as long as we're making small strides of improvement, that's the most important thing. So just make sure that this Ramadan, inshallah, is better than last Ramadan, even by a grain of salt, inshallah. Yes? Mhm. Very important. Very important. Judge the religion not based off of the people, but off of the religion itself. Inshallah. Yes. Yeah. Jazakumullah khair, everybody. Think I'm due again sometime in June, so we'll see you guys then, inshallah. Jazakumullah khaira. If you guys need to get in, huh? Ramadan. Yeah. So if you guys need anything from me in the meantime, or questions or whatever, Brother Jamal has my email address if you don't want to write it down now. Uh, that is a question for Jamal. I have no idea. Yeah. But my next scheduled thing is in June, inshallah. So I'm sure you guys have something next Sunday, so make sure that to come back, inshallah. جزاكم الله خيرا سبحان الله وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك جزاكم الله خيرا السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته